Let's talk about fantasy authors. G'day and welcome back to my channel. Or if you're new here, welcome. My name is Kathy and this is where I talk about all my pet hobbies. I was asked by several of my subscribers, or maybe one or two, to give a list of my favourite fantasy authors, as I have read a lot of fantasy fiction over the years. I initially had recorded a video just giving a list of all the authors, but I changed my mind and I decided that instead what I'm going to do is make this a series where I will be highlighting one fantasy author in each video. And this is the first video in the series. Now, I must admit that I wasn't always a fan of fantasy. In fact, I didn't really enjoy it when I was a child. I started reading fantasy in my mid-20s, back in the 80s, and I became such a big fan of it that now I think I have a fairly large fantasy collection. And it is interesting just how much that has changed over the years. Back then, when you went into a bookstore, you would only find a tiny little section of fantasy books. And then it seemed to gain popularity. And now, if you walk into a bookstore, there are rows and rows of it, which I love because it gives me a lot more choice. However, today I think there's also a lot of young adult fantasy fiction, and I am really not a fan of young adult fiction. I never was, even when I was a young adult. So I don't have a lot of those in this list, though there are a few. Oh, and I also wanted to point out that most of the authors I'm going to list will date back to the 80s. I don't read as much fantasy as I used to today, I must admit, and I'm much more selective as to what I do buy, simply because I don't have the room. I have really far too many bookshelves and I have no space for another one. I do occasionally buy the first book in, say, a series, and if I like the author, then I'll go and buy the rest. But unfortunately, I find that sometimes I don't. And finally, I also wanted to point out that I really love epic series. So most of the series I will be talking about will be more than 2 or 3 books. It could even be 10 or 14. Okay, I thought I would start with how I got into fantasy in the 80s. I am a huge fan of the Star Wars original series, films that is. And a lot of people were talking about Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy. This is the first book in the series. It is Heir to the Empire. Now, I know that this isn't strictly fantasy. It is science fiction, not hard science fiction. I would call it more space opera. I think that's the right term for it. And I am really not a fan of fan fiction, but I absolutely loved this series. I could not put it down. From the moment I started reading this, I was hooked completely, and I absolutely love these. These are now one of my all-time favorite series. And the reason I love these so much is because Timothy Zahn did such a wonderful job of capturing the characters from the films. His characterization was spot on. I felt like I was still watching the films when I was reading these books. The plot itself involves an admiral from the old empire who is trying to resurrect the empire, I guess you could call it that. And of course, our heroes are trying to stop him. I don't really want to say too much more about the plot. What I do want to say is that Zahn is an excellent writer. His pacing, the plot itself, a lot of the new characters that he introduces are very well drawn. Characters like Mara Jade or Card or Thrawn himself, who I think is a fascinating character. He has also brought out several other series since then, and I actually think he has a new one coming out this year or next year or last year. I don't know, but I will list all of these series in my description box below for anyone who is interested. Now, obviously, since the sequel films have come out, they have gone in a completely different direction to this, the Thrawn trilogy. But I don't think that matters. This is Timothy Zahn's vision of what happens to the characters after the return of the Jedi, and it is definitely well worth reading. Now, I have read a lot of other Star Wars fan fiction. I even own quite a few of them, but I don't like them. Whereas this one, I absolutely love and have no hesitation in recommending it to anyone who loves the films as much as I do. I have been wondering whether to score these books, and I think I will, though you will find out that I am a hard scorer, or so I have recently found out. I would score the Thrawn trilogy 8 out of 10. I have not read his more recent series, which also take place in the Star Wars universe, so I'm not going to score those. So I guess you could say that it was the Thrawn trilogy which led me down the road to fantasy. So I'm very grateful for that. Okay, well that is all I have for you guys today. Let me know what you think of this new series, and if you have read the Thrawn trilogy, I would love to hear your opinions on it. Well, as always, thank you guys so very much for hanging out with me. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Bye.